Hey everyone, welcome to Gadgets with Gurman. I'm Mark, and today we're going to be taking you through the latest in this drama of a different chip situation. It seems like every day we have another company coming through with an indication that their chips may be vulnerable to a situation where intruders might be able to get your information. People are talking about software updates that might potentially slow down your computer. We're getting a lot of questions on Twitter in our past episodes about this. Everyone was talking about it at CES, at the Intel keynote, different chip keynotes. So I decided we're going to bring on Ian King. He's our resident chip expert, writes about everything Intel, NVIDIA, Apple chips for Bloomberg. He knows everything there is to know about chips. So I wanted to ask him a bunch of questions from myself and you all about this chip situation. Ian, should we be worried? What do we have to worry about with this chip situation? Talk us through it.
That's a very good question. The answer right now is no need to panic. According to Apple, according to Intel, according to the people who are providing you with your Gmail, the Google server guys, the AWS, Amazon guys, the patches are in place, and there's been no report at this point of anybody gaining illicit access to anybody's information via these new exploits. So don't panic right now.
And I know this show, Gadgets with Gurman, we have a ton of Android fans, but I think the majority at this point is iPhone users, iOS users, iPads, Macs. What about iPhone users? Apple put out a pretty strong statement indicating that, hey, all of our devices, all our modern iPhones, iPads, Macs, except the Apple Watch is not vulnerable. Those all products are all vulnerable. What's going on there?
Right, so if we dial this back, Apple came out and did actually quite a good explainer. If you have time, look at their website where they said, all modern processors are vulnerable to these potential exploits, including the ones that they design themselves for all of their products, including the ones that they get from Intel for their computers. What they said was, don't worry, we've already patched all of our processors, all of our machines in a way that will make sure that they are safe. So if you've got an iOS device, if you've got a Mac, make sure you're up to date. Okay, if you make sure that you've downloaded and updated your operating systems, you should be fine.
In addition to that, I know there's two different types of vulnerabilities here. There's Spectre, like my favorite James Bond movie, and Meltdown, probably the name of a future James Bond movie. Right. And one of them has to do with the Safari web browser, so there's a way an intruder can break through there. And Spectre is through the main file system itself using a process called speculative execution. So for one of those flaws, I believe it was the Meltdown one, they had the 11.1.2 security software updates issued to the phones directly. But then there was a Safari update for the Mac that you would update through the Mac App Store, which would avoid that issue coming through the web browser. So just to be sure, make sure you get the Mac update for the Mac operating system itself, the tvOS update for if you have an Apple TV, the iPad iOS and iPhone iOS updates, but also the Safari updates on the Mac side. So it's important that you're covered on all your bases. Now, a lot of people are wondering, how does this slow down the computers? Because there was talk anywhere from 5% to 30%. Based on what Apple says, their software updates are not going to affect the performance of their iOS and Mac devices, but Safari might slow down a couple percentage points. What about on the other products? So what do you think about these slowdowns? Is it true? Should people be concerned?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I think this is probably going to be the lasting impact of this issue. Google has said one thing, AWS has said another, Microsoft has said another, Intel has said another. The net answer is we probably don't know what the overall impact is. What I can tell you is we've got a couple of machines here, really high-end.
Let's zoom into these and take a look so we can see the inside here.
Okay, so not that you need to know this, but this is an Intel 8700 brand new, top-of-the-line processor here, the kind of thing that you're going to have in a gaming system. Okay, if you've got a machine with a several $100 processor like this, you've got nothing to worry about. I've been messing around with this. I've been trying it out. I've been updating it. It doesn't even notice. There's nothing that a normal user could do with a system like that where they're going to notice any slowdowns at all. If you've got a laptop that's a brand new laptop, again, the experiments I've been running, the trials I've been doing, you really don't need to worry about that.
So theoretically, and let's go back to the other camera here, theoretically, if the software updates do indeed slow down the machine, what Ian is saying here, and based on my own tests of the Safari web browser, even if the benchmarks, like the true mathematical computations are saying there's going to be a change here, in reality, you're probably not going to feel anything, even in the high-end gaming that Ian has been using this machine to test out. Now, what about Android? Because we have a lot of Android users as well. How is Android affected? I saw Google put out a bunch of statements about their different products. What's being affected there?
Okay, I mean, there are a couple of concerns here. First of all, ARM, their technology is at the basis of all of the processors that run Android phones, said we're vulnerable. About 5% of our chips made over their lifetime that they've been designing chips are vulnerable. So in theory, your smartphone is vulnerable to some of these exploits, and you need to go out and find those Android patches. The problem with Android, unlike iOS, as you know, Mark, is who's updating it? Is it the carrier? Is it the manufacturer of the phone, Samsung, Motorola, whoever? Who's responsible for it? And it's, there's this phenomenon called fragmentation, which in theory could get in the way of Android being as protected as it should be. So again, if you've got an Android phone, go out there, press that update button, and make sure you've got the latest patches. Make sure you're absolutely sure that you've put everything you possibly can onto your phone that will protect you.
And just to add to that, the Google Pixel, the advantage of getting the Pixel phone, it's made by Google. In addition, they make Android software, as you probably know if you're watching this, but they put out security updates for the Pixel phones, both the first generation and second generation, the big ones and small ones, quite regularly. So I would assume that those software updates already hit your phone. I saw Essential Phone, we had an episode on that earlier. They put out a statement on Twitter saying they have a software security update coming out from that. So if you have a Samsung phone, a Huawei phone, a Xiaomi phone, other Android types of phones, I would check with your software update panel in the settings menu, check with your provider, your carrier, to see if you're vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, there've been no reports of any slowdowns in Android phones yet, just like there've been no reports of any exploits. So again, it's not a panic situation, but it is something that you should really pay attention to and make sure that you don't get caught out.
Now let's go back to this other shot here, because I want to focus in. Ian, can you point out exactly where the processor itself, what's the issue here, which component does it come down to?
Okay, so this is your power, this is your hard disk storage, this is your graphics card, and under this here, which is actually a water cooler, you want to put water and electricity together, that's what's going on here. That's the microprocessor. That's really the brains of the computer. That's the one that does all of the heavy lifting. Now, the mechanics of this, for several years, computer makers, computer processor designers have been doing something called out-of-order execution, whereby the processor, in order to be faster, it thinks to itself, what do I need to do next? What should I be ready to do based upon what's going on right now? Jumps ahead, goes and gets the data. That was thought to be perfect, a beautiful, elegant solution that was making all of our machinery faster. Turns out that's what's made these machines potentially vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to break it down some more, the function of the processor is that it's really, and Ian can talk to this too, is really the brains of the computer. It's sort of the engine. It's what processes everything. You want to send a text message. You want to go to a web browser. The processor is the heart, the brain. It's pretty much the everything of what the computer is. It's the most critical component from the very beginning of processors. And what you see here is this issue coming out of 10 to 20 years of processor design. So computer makers, manufacturers of these chips, they're not really going to be able to design out these problems in the near term. This is something they're going to have to fix from software. And I know we're showing you the insides of a computer here, but by no means, people aren't going to have to dive into their computer to fix things like a mechanic or anything. This is all going to be resolved through software until chip makers redesign their whole portfolios there.
Yeah, one of the points is you don't stamp these out in a widget factory and they appear after 10 minutes on a production line. You're looking at almost years of design time, tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. There's several billion transistors on something that is just that size.
Right, and transistors, those are like the individual...
The little switches, right?
Right, the individual components that make it up.
A machine and a person have laid all of those out. So you don't just go, oh, okay, we'll fix this, we'll put a few more transistors on, or we'll rewrite. That's not possible, okay? Have to use software. Software is inherently slower than hardware.
How much time does it take to produce one chip for one Intel computer?
About 3 months to go through the production line.
Wow.
That's just the manufacturing time only.
And there's automation and people involved.
Very few people.
Now, we're talking about Intel here a lot, and I know Intel is a company you cover, but this is not an Intel exclusive issue. There's basically 3 major chip providers that are all vulnerable in one way or another. That's Intel, as we're talking about, AMD, right, and ARM. So to break those down, Intel is the main computer chip that you find in every Mac computer to date, Dell PCs, all sorts of PCs from different PC makers. ARM is the type of component, the type of chip, it's a special type of processor that's not really used in desktops or laptops so much, but mostly used in smartphones and tablets and gaming consoles. And then AMD is mostly on the graphics side. So I want to break down, is ARM and AMD affected, and how affected are they compared to Intel?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. You have to really read the fine print on this. There's been various statements about levels of exposure to different aspects or different attack avenues, but they're all basically taking advantage of the same feature that's in all processors. They're just implemented in different ways. So the simple answer is everything is potentially at risk. Okay, check your patches.
Right, and ARM, back to Apple and Android, ARM are the chips you have to worry about, or not necessarily worry about, it's what you have to know about if you're using an Android phone, another type of smartphone from even Chinese makers, as well as the iPhone and the iPad. That's for that. AMD graphics chips, they're in Macs, some Mac computers.
AMD also does microprocessors. They're the only rival to Intel in PCs.
In high performance
That's correct,
desktop PCs. So we have a bunch of other questions coming in here, and people are still asking, they really want to know, will their computer slow down, especially if they have a PC, from this? So will your iPhone slow down? Will your iPad slow down? Will your gaming rig slow down?
Right, that's a very good question. So if we look at what we've got here, I mean, just look at this, right? Does this look slowed down to you? Okay, this is a 4K game. This is one of the latest games out there. Clearly, if you've got a system like this, which is brand new, this kind of, it's a $350 processor, a $1,000 graphics card, you don't have anything to worry about.
So in the real world, you're not going to notice it. But let's talk numbers.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
So no, something like this, if you've spent a lot of money, or even something like this is a $2,000 laptop, no problem at all. Older systems are where you might have a problem. If you bought a laptop, if you bought a computer 5 years ago, that's where we might see the slowdown.
Right, and what percentage point do you think people on older computers might see? 10% slower, 30% slower? What's the maximum here, and what's the minimum?
Intel, when they first came out, said probably little to nothing, but in edge cases, in extreme situations, as much as 30%. If it's 30%, then it's slowing down. It's like making your machine even 5 years older, right? Which you obviously don't want. So some people have been saying, actually, this is probably good for Intel in the short term, because if you've got an old machine, if you haven't replaced it, if you're one of these 450 million people that have got a 5-year-old machine, maybe you need a new one. Maybe it's time to go and spend $2,000 on a new machine like this.
Right, and we have a lot of viewers who are very interested and worried about this topic just joining us. So I think let's start from the top. Sure. Let's break this down from the very beginning. Okay. So what happened? What started all this? Okay. Give us the background.
So in the middle of last year, some computer researchers were looking into the theory, the kind of people that do research into the background. And really, most attacks on computers are done through software. You try to con software or put false software in there. Nobody's really looked at hardware. These guys are doing a bit of theoretical research, looked at something that modern processors do to make them faster, and said, oh yeah, in theory, this could be a way to get in to a computer and get some of the really important, encryption or password data. But at the time, they were like, yeah, but a company like Intel would never let this happen. Then they ran some tests, and then they started swearing because they found it was possible. Then they went to Intel, told Intel. Intel were like, thank you very much for telling me. We need to work on this. Intel then went out, told Microsoft, told Google, told Amazon, told everybody in the computing ecosystem, we need to work on this. And they were all working behind the scenes, because the way you do this, you put a fix in place, then you announce the problem.
Right.
For obvious reasons.
How do you know if you're affected? Let's say you're an iPhone user, an iPad user, a PC user. Is there any way to know if you're affected?
Right now, we've been told that nobody's been affected by this. They've gone out and said there's been no evidence of anybody exploiting this. But I think the simple answer is, now that the bad guys know that this loophole is here, they're working on it.
So to be clear, everyone is pretty much vulnerable, right? But no one is actually affected. We haven't seen any real exploits to date to take advantage of this. But as Ian is saying, all the bad guys know about it now. they're going to try to hack into computers. What kind of information and data, theoretically, could be taken from a vulnerable computer that's not patched? And how good are these patches? How do we know that those solve the issues?
Right. It's still early days in terms of the patches being deployed. We have to take the company's assurances that they're safe. But this is a really fundamental thing, right? We're not talking about introducing a virus. We're not talking about putting code on that's going to remotely take control of your software, steal your data. We're talking about a way to get into hardware that was previously thought to be secure, could get an encryption key, could get a password, could get those cookies that save your passwords in a browser. Those are all the exploits which could obviously really open up your computer and make you totally vulnerable, and that's a really scary thing.
So in simple terms, and just to add to that in terms of the encryption code and all that, what kind of raw data could an intruder potentially get? We have lots of people curious. Passwords, emails, photos, what types of things are potentially vulnerable?
Data like your photos, no. Things like encryption keys that would potentially allow people to then go back to your machine and load malicious code that would then steal your data, yes.
But immediately, I don't think anyone is really at risk of losing their photos to intruders or emails or passwords. This is all very theoretical. But the fact that there is a long-standing 10 to 20-year-long issue with the very fundamental components of processors that you can see in here, like this Intel chip behind that board right there, that's newsworthy and that's worrisome. Is updating software all you can do? We have some people asking that.
Right now, yes. Intel have said, look, right now, software patches are the answer. Future chips that we have in the design process, ARM have also said this, chips that are in the design process that will appear as early as later this year will have this built into the hardware, into those transistors that make the chip do what it does. At that point, everything will be fine, everything will be fast. Do you want to go out and buy a new computer based upon that? I would probably not do that myself. If I was in the market for a new computer, if I had one that was 5 years old, it might speed up my decision.
Right, so I think this gets us to another good question. Is this really good for Intel and the computer makers, or is it bad? Because down the road, this can spur adoption of new technology, new processors, people will be able to sell new software and services on it. Obviously, Intel will get a bigger chunk now of more computers sold. Is Apple going to sell more Macs because of this when they start advertising these having new chips? What's going on here from a financials perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. Intel has already been out there saying that there's 450 million people have machines that are more than 5 years old. And it's saying if you switch from one of those to, say, this laptop, which is brand new, this is a Lenovo Yoga $2,000 machine that we've been testing out, which, as you can see, displays
Bloomberg. But that's another one that even if this is vulnerable, which it is, because this runs an Intel CPU, you have the Intel Inside sticker on there, it's vulnerable. A hacker can theoretically get in there and steal your stuff. But will you be affected? That's the question.
The difference is, if you patch this one, because it's got a brand new processor in it, you're much, much less likely to see any slowdown.
Right, so if you're using it in practice, you'll never know the difference. You just want to make sure to install the latest software updates to make sure you're not affected. But there is something we didn't discuss that's actually very important to a lot of us. A lot of us, we use our phones, we use our computers, our gaming PCs, but all these devices, they are hooked up to the internet, and they're all leveraging cloud services like email and Facebook and Twitter and iMessage, and all those services are powered by this imaginary cloud. What a cloud really is, for people who are not familiar, it's not your information actually stored with a bunch of water droplets in the sky. It's servers, right? It's server farms. It's acres and acres of physical servers that you would normally get in terms of a hard drive in a computer.
Machines like this, except without a monitor, basically.
Right, exactly. Storing all your data and then feeding it back to you through pipes under the waters, through the internet. Those are vulnerable too. We have a lot of cloud storage makers, Amazon, Google, all these companies, fretting about this. Talk us through that. Are they affected?
No, that's a very good question. Right? The reason that everybody's focusing on Intel is because in that market, for those really, really important machines, Intel has a 99.4, maybe 99.6 market share.
And you're talking about Intel processors having over 99% market share for stacks of cloud storage computers that are used in server farms.
Basically, all of that machinery uses Intel, so they're all, in theory, vulnerable. All we can say at this point is AWS, Amazon's web services, Microsoft Azure, which does cloud services,
All of them.
All
Apple
of them.
uses iCloud.
Apple,
they have
right?
their server
iCloud.
farms.
They've all come out and said, we're not seeing any slowdowns. We've patched all of our machines. They're all safe. Don't worry about it. And that's kind of one of the interesting things here, is because they control the software. They control what comes in or out of their system much more tightly than, say, a corporate server or your PC at home. People are arguing actually that might be a safer way to do things, because they literally, one patch, one switch, everything's in theory safe. Right. And they're saying it's not slowed down. We don't know why it's not slowed down. Maybe they've put many more machines there. Maybe they're just using high-end Intel stuff in the first place. We don't actually know, but they are giving us a guarantee saying, don't worry about it.
So in summary here, every computer that you probably have in your house, every phone you have, every gaming console, every tablet, these run chips that are vulnerable to the Spectre and Meltdown potential attacks. They are vulnerable. But has anyone really exploited them? Have they been affected? The answer is no. Will your iPhone slow down? Will your iPad slow down? Will your really high-end gaming rig or new PC or MacBook laptop get slower from the software updates? No. You're not going to notice it. The numbers might be off a little bit. The math, the benchmarks might say so. But in reality, I don't think users have anything to worry about right now until this actually gets exploited. And hopefully we'll be able to bring the news to you when there is a hack out there. And hopefully companies will,
hopefully there isn't one.
Right, hopefully there isn't one. And if there is one, we'll be sure to bring you the news about how to avoid getting your information infiltrated. So for now, don't worry. Update your phone, update your computer, update your tablets. If you have a much older computer, 5 to 10 years old, and you're seeing significant slowdowns because of the software updates, it might be time to upgrade anyways. So thanks for joining us. Hopefully this calmed down some fears about the situation. If you have more questions about this, read our stuff on Bloomberg.com/technology. You can follow Ian on Twitter, twitter.com/IanMKing, me at twitter.com/Mark Gurman. Ian, thank you so much for joining us today on Gadgets with Gurman. We really appreciate it. And we'll have Ian on again in the future. Thanks all.